Well, welcome everyone. My name is Hillary Heath. Sorry, I have a cold. My name is Hillary Heath. I am the Program Associate for the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. And the Climate Justice Resilience Fund launched what's called our Solution Series, which is one of today's sessions. And the Solution Series is just a space for CJRF partners to kind of come together, share lessons, challenges, and outcomes of their work with other CJRF partners, funders, and climate practitioners. And so we're really glad to have you here. Today's session is with Doc Society. Doc Society is a British nonprofit committed to the power of documentary films to engage and connect people, transform communities, and improve societies. And I've been told that today's session is going to be really about climate narratives, kind of in practice. And so I will turn it over to the lovely Doc Society team to take it from here.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you for the invitation. We're so happy to be here. Maybe we can do a quick round of intros. I'm Louise. I work for Doc Society for just over a year now as a grants officer for the Climate Story Unit, and I'm based in the Netherlands. And I'll pass it over to my colleague, Nikki.
Hey, everyone. Good morning. My name is Nikki. I'm based in New York City. I work for Doc Society, providing editorial support across the org and managing a couple of our funds. Really looking forward to this conversation about co-creation and storytelling. Pass it over to Wanja.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from what is this weather? Lukewarm. Is it something like that in weather? It's like a lukewarmish weather in Nairobi, Kenya, where I am based, and I'm part of the Doc Society team working with the Climate Story Labs, supporting our partners and cultural allies globally, and also with the Global Climate Storyteller Network, which is a community of storytellers and where we share support in resources and networks and information to help strengthen our work and to be in community. I'm so excited to meet all of you and to be here.
Thanks. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can everyone see it? Just to give a little bit of a background, CJRF is our partner in the Climate Story Unit. So they've been supporting our Indigenous storytelling across the programmatic areas. And, we really appreciate CJRF's approach with participatory grant making, and having this partnership really made us reflect more on, our own grant making practices, and also to reaffirm participatory practices in filmmaking that we have supported throughout the years. So I'm going to pass it, before we start, I wanted to just have like a little question for everyone to put in the chat. We're talking about co-creation, but that can mean so many things. So before we go deep into it, I just want to know, what do you think co-creation is? What does it mean to you? And you can put it in the chat, and we're going to try to read your answers. There's no wrong or right answers, by the way. Don't feel shy, anyone? No guesses? Collective innovation based on shared narrative frames. That's very nice. Working alongside the community impacted. Also true. Yeah, I think we have a common sharing of co-creation means. So now let's try to rewind a little bit and give a bit of context of what we do and what co-creation means to us. So I'm going to pass it over to Wanja.
Yes, so as Hillary started us off, Doc Society has, sorry, 1 second. Doc Society has been in existence for the last 18 years. And throughout this time, we have developed deep expertise in guiding independent storytellers through their production and impact campaign journeys by granting funding to storytellers across the globe, building regional networks of storytellers and change makers, advocacy organizations, and advancing the field through developing and sharing of tools and resources. And so Climate Story Unit then brings this expertise together as an effort to address the climate emergency. And so as practitioners of cultural strategy, our role really is to bridge the media and the climate ecosystems by accelerating creative storytelling that activates strategic audiences. So this means that at least what we try and do is take a holistic approach, developing a series of interdependent initiatives that are working towards just 3 goals that I'm going to share with you very briefly. And our first goal is to expand the breadth of compelling stories and impact campaigns that center communities most impacted by the climate emergency. And then our second goal that we try and aspire towards is to spur new partnerships among storytellers, movement leaders, and impacted communities and climate experts to mobilize strategic audiences towards action. And our third goal is to grow confidence in the power of cultural strategy to address the climate emergency by advocating to and collaborating with media industry players and philanthropy to prioritize climate storytelling in all these different spheres. And so we have 4 main programs. 2 of them are more or less like, what we like to think of public facing. I'm going to briefly share with you what they are. We have the Climate Story Labs, which I very briefly mentioned, and these are a series. They are a series of locally organized gatherings that convene regional networks of practitioners to define and elevate new narratives. So far, we've had 14 labs, and we have one literally coming up next month in Iraq, and we'll have other editions in the Nordic region, in the MENA region. And of course, we're more than happy for you to join us, and we're more than happy as well to keep you updated. The question we always ask in these labs is, what are the stories we need now, here, in this place? And how do those stories reflect the realities of the challenges or of the communities in those regions? And so the other program that we have within the unit is the fund. This is the Climate Story Fund. And this fund, basically, it's an accelerant fund that supports stories and impact campaigns that shift the climate narrative and engage strategic audiences. So far, we've disbursed over $2 million to a new cohort of storytelling that's going to be very, very soon unveiled this year. And we're so excited to share with you the projects that have been shortlisted for this. And then we have the Climate Story Kitchen, which is more or less like our R&D space. This is an experimental space where we test and iterate new models in climate storytelling, including landmark collaboration with public broadcasters to support production and distribution of climate-themed stories across the country and the regions where we work. And last, but by no means the least, we have the ecosystem influencing, and this is continuous, right? And it's a media ecosystem advocacy to create the conditions that will support this new climate narratives that we're talking about, with a new focus to put pressure on broadcasters and streamers to support climate stories, right? And to allocate more resources to alternative distribution channels, again, in all the regions that we work, and working together with our cultural organizers in all the places that we have Climate Story Labs or where we are involved in funding. So at a glance, that's us. And back to you, Louise.
Thank you, Wanja. And yeah, now that we understand a little bit about what the Climate Story Unit does, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the participatory approaches of our work and like why this topic. I begin saying a little bit about how CJRF's journey with participatory grant making really, influenced us to rethink and reaffirm some of our values. And last year, we gathered as a team to discuss what participatory grant making meant to us, how we could incorporate trust-based philanthropy approach in our work as a re-grantor organization. And we realized that although those terms are not exactly the same, they all mean that we want to shift power in philanthropy. So the question that we're asking ourselves is like, how can we move towards being a more power-shifting philanthropy? And there's a few ways on how we've been trying to do that. First, it's in our ethos that we share everything. We've been building the field of documentary by sharing the best practices with filmmakers, impact producers, and cultural organizers, sharing resources openly. The other thing is that we try to build trust-based relationship with our grantees, having less contractual requirements, less reporting, and less application burden where we can. We also try to have deep collaboration with our cultural organizers that are in the regions, surfacing the stories and the ecosystem storytelling in those regions. We also, when we support the filmmakers, our support goes a little bit beyond the money as well. We do editorial support, we do legal and safety support to storytellers when needed. So we're also there for our grantees in many other ways. And throughout our process of selecting stories and also of supporting the grantees, we try to incorporate and invite as many regional and issue experts that we can to collaborate on different stages of the selection process, but also while we're supporting the grantees. So as re-granters, like the concept of participation goes also a bit beyond of what we're doing internally. Like this is important, but it also has to do with the practice of filmmaking and storytelling itself. So what does co-creation mean for storytelling? So it all starts with, define the concept of the extractive storytelling. And before I can start talking about co-creation, we have to understand first what extractive storytelling means. So again, I'm going to ask you to put in the chat, what do you think this means? Like extractive storytelling, what does it make you think? Like it can be a word, it doesn't have to be a sentence. What do you think when I say extractive storytelling? Or even if you have an example of a story that you think it's extractive. Taking from community, dictating the narrative. And while you're answering on the chat, I also want to state that for this presentation, we've been using this incredible book called Collective Wisdom by Kat Zizek and William Uricchio, and they've collaborated with many artists to write this book called Collective Wisdom. And a lot of the concepts that you're going to see throughout this presentation came from this book. Storytelling that makes assumptions about others and put a spin on the narrative the community would not. Using someone else's stories without their input, insight, or permission. Climate change storytelling that removes people's agency seems extractive. All of this is 100% right, and you're going to see a lot of those words throughout our presentation as well. So I'm glad that we're aligned. So I'm going to show you the picture that I think it really illustrates what extractive storytelling is. This idea of a filmmaker who comes from the outside, parachutes in a foreign land, makes a film about a community, and then leaves to the next project, without considering what the film can do or has done to the community. The protagonists have no say in the story and how they will look like on screen. They have no control over the narrative. The protagonists, the community, do not receive any compensation for being on the film, or the time for their time, or for their stories. The exposure of the films puts them who are in the front line of these issues in evidence and risk with no concern for their integrity. And this one author of the film, usually the director, holds all the power and the prestige of the film and is celebrated as the only author and creator of the story. So like many things, colonialism can be found at the root of this extractive method. And, a lot of people say that was what documentary was built on. Documentary film began as an anthropological study, Western white men traveling to foreign lands to capture footage of an exotic, different culture. And, Western filmmakers controlled the stories they edited, and they held all the power. So storytelling in itself has, is a flow of power, and, who's controlling the narrative is really important for us to interrogate. It's a very big and nuanced conversation, and we don't have time for a full history lesson here, but, it's just important to understand where we're coming from and how we can go from, where we can go from here. And it's an exciting time on the field. Like, things are changing a little bit. A lot of art forms and industries, and documentary being one of them, has been going through a lot of changes and doing a lot of work to decolonize the field of documentary. And one of the approaches is co-creation. So yeah, in the last years, we've seen a shift, and as a new type of consciousness enters the field, and we've been moving more towards co-creative practices. And here's where the fun comes in. So I have this quote there for you from the amazing Chimamanda, where she says, "When we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise." And yeah, she couldn't be more right. Co-creation, we didn't make up this term on the documentary industry. It's something that happens in many other fields, including education, technology, urban design, and health. Like we saw in the pandemic, a lot of people coming together to create a vaccine in record time. So even though there are different approaches to what co-creation means in different fields, it's all about, the alternative to the singular voice of authorship, control, ownership. And, according to the Collective Wisdom book, in media, co-creation is defined by, the approaches and the methodologies that offer alternatives to the singular author vision and seek collaborative processes to achieve justice. So when you are in a co-creation space, the projects will emerge from the process. And it's all about, sharing the power and moving away from the single author idea. And yeah, just want to highlight that we'll be talking about different types of power sharing within nonfiction storytelling and more largely filmmaking throughout this presentation. And I also recognize we've been using a lot of words and terms that have very similar meanings, such as collaboration, participation, co-creation. And although they might seem interchangeable, they have some differences. So again, I wanted to ask you in the chat, what do you think the difference is? What is the difference between participation and co-creation? Are they the same? Any thoughts? Ownership and participation, not all own the narrative equally. That's right. The extent of ownership. Participation is more limited. It can still be edited out. Yeah, that is true. Participation does not mean that you are helping dictate the narrative. Participation does not guarantee ownership compared to co-creation. Yeah, that's it. So maybe this next image here can help us illustrate a little bit what we mean about co-creation. And again, according to collective wisdom, participation assumes that there's one person who created the art and the others are participating on it, but ultimately it's still one person's creation. Co-creation, on the other hand, it's a more distributed network of actors coming together to create something together. So as you can see on the slide, there's a spectrum of collaboration, and co-creation and participations are different parts of this spectrum. And, there's no right or wrong again. We're going to try to launch a poll just as I'm stop sharing this presentation, but I wanted to ask you to reflect, looking at this spectrum and thinking of your field and your organization, where do you stand in this spectrum? And again, there's no wrong answers, because some fields are more conducive to co-creation than others. There's no judgment here. You can stand at any part of the spectrum. And so on the right, you have, the media maker is in service to the partner. In this case, like your organization could be in service to the partner or to the grantees or to the beneficiaries. And on the left, it's the other way around. Mostly it's media maker driven. So the filmmaker drives and the partner participates on it. And co-creation is the middle when, both of them come together to create together. And yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing the presentation so we can launch the poll. Hillary, can you, when you feel like we have enough answers, can you share the results with us as well?
Yeah. Answers are still coming in, but it looks like overwhelmingly people are saying that their organization is at the co-creation end of the spectrum. 11 out of 15 have said that. 2 have said that it's partner driven, and one has said it's organization driven.
That's super interesting. I'm going to try to share again the presentation. Just 1 second. I think to put it all in perspective, we need some examples. Can you see the presentation again? Yeah. So we wanted to spotlight a few projects and, to put all the concepts into context. We can look at a few of them. In our cohorts, we have, supported many projects that are trying different co-creative approaches. And this is especially important when it comes to, films that are centered on frontline communities, who are defending land and human rights. The first story is Call to Territory. You might have heard of this one. It's an immersive look at the fight of the indigenous Uruguay people against deforestation brought by farmers and illegal settlers in the Brazilian Amazon. So we're gonna share the trailer with you now. And can I ask you if you could please mute your microphone? That'll be great. Thank you.
A floresta, os rios, é a nossa casa, onde a gente se mantém.
Porque o urueu-uau é como se fosse uma barreira.
Tudo desmatado.
Ela é, para mim, no meu ponto de vista, o coração, não do Brasil, mas sim do planeta em geral.
O sonho brasileiro de quem está vivendo aqui é ter seu pedacinho de terra para poder trabalhar, né? Tirar ali o seu sustento. Produzindo alguma coisa, plantando para fazer nosso Brasil ir para frente. Eu mesmo, nunca vi nada de índio.
Fala, ninguém nunca viu, não.
É, só fala, tá?
E o que eu fico revoltado é que a gente ainda é considerado bandido, pessoas que atrapalham o país, entendeu?
Desce no coco, vai estar no rio. Eu tô ali, eu acho. O cara vai estar ali, né? Vai.
a terra. Mas, no meu ponto de vista, eu acho que eles querem mais do que a terra. Eles querem acabar com o povo indígena, acabar com os isolados. A gente não vai permitir que aconteça, não.
Amazing. Thank you, Nikki, for sharing. Let's go back to the presentation. So the Territory is like a great film where I love it, and I'm a bit biased because I'm from Brazil. It's a great example of deep collaboration, you know, like the film really has set new standards as the Uruê indigenous community both co-produced, they partly filmed, co-owned the film, and are leading the impact strategy and the impact campaign of the film. So it's a really good example. But like were the production co-creative? First, they started with an exercise of flipping the camera. So, you know, historically, we know that a lot has been taken away from indigenous communities, and they are really skeptical of outsiders, and especially foreigner outsiders. So for that reason, you know, it was difficult for them to build trust, and the filmmakers decided to, you know, flip the camera and give the cameras to them and make them shoot the filmmakers and ask the questions, you know, like, what were the intentions coming into this film? Like, what did they wanted from it? So it really helped, you know, it was an exercise that helped with this shifting the power dynamics between them. And a lot of how the film was, you know, shot has the influence of Tangai, who's a community member, who is a very observant school teacher, and he worked as the cinematographer of the film. And, you know, the cinematographer really drives the way, you know, the story is framed and how, you know, this community is portrayed on screen. And, you know, he managed to do that in a very authentic and engaging and respectful way that only a community member could have done. Like, and he's been nominated for, you know, a few awards for Best Cinematography, including the Cinema Eye Honors Awards and the Critics' Choice Documentary Awards. And yeah, it was not just him, like other members of the community were holding executive positions in the film team, including Chai Surui, who's in the picture, and she's a very famous indigenous activist in Brazil. And her mom, Neidinha, who's the protagonist and activist of the film, and Bitate, the other protagonist, they've been also leading on the impact work. So they all the three of them and other you know, members of the film team have been going to talks, conferences, and, you know, have been speaking to influential stakeholders. They've been at, you know, a few of the past COPs, as you can see in the photo there, Climate Week, the Cannes Festival. They've spoken to European parliaments, they've spoken to the UK Parliament, and, you know, they've been really active in making the film, but also in the advocacy work around the film and that followed the film. And, you know, this film was built and shaped in a very collaborative way, and some aspects of it really were only possible because of this ongoing collaboration. So Bitate and Neidinha, as you can see in the photo, the two in the middle, Bitate on the middle left and Neidinha on the middle right, are the protagonists and the activists of the film. And they were the ones that suggested that they should also show in the film the side of the settlers and, you know, like to really include them in the narrative. And according to them, the audience was not going to understand, you know, the source of this conflict that's been going for ages if they didn't hear from the other side. So their contribution was really important also to building the narrative of the film. And, you know, because of, you know, telling both sides of the story, this access also comes, you know, with responsibility, and they had to navigate, you know, the risks and really like establish rules on how to communicate with both sides and still maintaining everyone's integrity. And there were some narrative turns that really illustrated, you know, like the gravity of the conflict and how serious it was, including a kidnapping scare, the death of a community member, and the COVID pandemic. And they really had to navigate it together, the film team with the community of like, what would be the next steps. Ooh, sorry. Oh, yeah, we're all muted. And in order to do that, the agency, and I've seen in the chat before, like about agency, that the agency was really important, and it was important that the frontline community had the agency to, decide on how the story was going to be told, especially dealing with such tragedies. And we have two examples of that. One was about shooting during the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, the film team could not go to Brazil. And the community, who in the beginning had that exercise of flipping the camera, they had the ability to shoot the film, and they decided to continue filming themselves. And, an important scene in the film where a Sarah is being arrested in the indigenous land was only possible because they had the cameras and they were shooting. That was a very spontaneous scene, and I think the filmmakers wouldn't be able to shoot that scene otherwise. So it was really important that they had this decision about shooting during the pandemic together. The second one was about shooting a funeral, and it was a big dilemma because in their indigenous culture, there's this ancestral tradition of not mentioning or not portraying the deceased, and it was they had a lot of this dilemma between should they do that or should they still fight for justice. And in the end, the community decided that they wanted to shoot the funeral, that they wanted to continue the film. And this decision could have only been made by someone from the community and no one else. So even if the director was in Brazil at the time, he wouldn't have been able to shoot that scene. So it was really important that they, had space to make those important decisions about their own stories. And in the end, they sold the film to Nat Geo, and they are now co-owners of their own stories, and they're also able to use the film to amplify their own advocacy. So yeah, it's really important that, the documentary serves a purpose to the community. There are positive impacts for those frontline communities. And, the film has had an amazing impact run, and through their impact campaign, they've been able to accomplish so much. They've been raising the profile of land defenders. They managed to, show the film to the European Parliament just before a voting of a legislation around products bought in deforested areas. And a lot of the MPs actually mentioned the film while voting. They also managed to do lobbying for a French supermarket chain to stop, buying products from protected indigenous land. Now they're in a phase of their impact campaign that they're doing community screenings across Brazil, trying to create dialogue between both parts of the conflict. And also now what they're trying to do is to build a media center in the Uruguay community land. And, it's their idea to train new generations of indigenous filmmakers. And, this is one of our many impactful climate stories, but we have also other films in our slate who have had, amazing co-creative practices too. And I'm going to pass it over to Nikki to talk about the next one.
Thank you, Louise. That was such a great rundown of one example of really deep co-creation and incredible power sharing with the territory. So I'm going to talk a little bit about another film called In My Blood It Runs. This film came out in 2019 out of Australia. It's an observational feature documentary that follows a 10-year-old Arrente Aboriginal boy named Duwan as he grows up in Alice Springs, Australia. So let's watch the trailer and then we can dive in a little bit more. Bear with me while I get the file out. Okay, here we go. Thanks.
How many kids do you have?
3.
What one do you love?
The whole 3, you say?
It's really important to look after your family members. Bush medicine heals up your body. Sometimes it goes to our hands.
Duan is the one that I worry about the most. He's got his own mind.
It's about the history of our country. He claimed for the English country the whole of this new land.
What happened at school?
The history that we told at school, that was for white people.
They don't know their culture. They don't teach them their culture.
Duan ran away from school today at about 1:30.
Do you want to get locked up with those other kids? This is your last chance.
They're not gonna take my grandchildren away from me. We want our kids to grow up learning in God's ways. Say it in Gadagal.
The first one that had the magic was the first people that had the land.
We want our language. We want our stories told to our children.
Don't know what's gonna happen after that.
What I want is a normal life of just being me. I just felt something, a memory.
Okay. I love this film. As you can see, it doesn't have super direct climate themes in the same way that The Territory did. But I think it's kind of naturally has issues of land protection and ownership, but really just follows Duan, who's this young boy who's been designated with the gift of being a traditional healer. And so we wanted to talk about this film because the film team really participated in a lot of deep co-creation with Duan and his family in order to make the film. With so many sensitivities around how traditional landowners and Aboriginal people have been portrayed by the media in the past in Australia, it was particularly important to Maya Newell, who was the director, to make this film in deep collaboration with Duan and his family and the elders of the community. And I think you can really feel it. Duan is such a powerful presence, and you can feel the care that he and his family have for this film in telling their own stories. But I also want to mention that the film doesn't shy away from some tougher moments. And I think in a lot of films, there can be a hesitation with co-creative storytelling because sometimes people get a little tripped up of like, will a participant, a character, a protagonist want to show some of the darker sides of their lives or their experiences? But I think that's why being in deep relationship with the participants of a film really creates opportunity for nuanced portrayals and different perspectives within storytelling. So let's talk a little bit about some of the core pillars that guided this team's approach. And as Louise has said, not every film is conducive to co-creation. It just might not make sense for some films, for instance, that are more investigative reporting type of films that are trying to like take down big power structures. Like it's all going to look very different from story to story. And even within co-creation, it should also look different. Each film's approach should look different because the people that we're working with are going to have different needs and different desires of what they want from the film. Okay, so with that, here are some of the things that this particular film team for In My Blood It Runs centered. And I think a lot of their general practices can kind of be used as almost a blueprint for things to keep in mind when we're doing co-creative storytelling. So the first one, which we've talked about before, is partnership with those represented. This means meaningful, ongoing consultation, establishing models of how to work together, and building production strategies together as a group, instead of kind of that directorial centered vision being imposed upon the participants. And so this film team really worked with the community to build a structure of the film that would work for them to tell their story. This meant that the filmmakers and their egos largely had to take a back seat. And the priority was making sure that the family had agency and ownership throughout the entire process. A second big thing that is necessary for co-creation is a timeline that allows for collaboration. Collaboration requires trust. We have to build trust with the people that we're filming. And sometimes that can take a really long time. And so we have to adjust our production schedules for that trust building, making sure that the timeline allows for change and shift depending on the needs of the participants. And when I say participants, I'm talking about what we usually call characters in films, protagonists, but participants implies more agency. The third thing that this film did was they understood that consent needs to be a priority. So even before picking up a camera, we recognize that our stories, the stories that we're filming are not always ours to tell. And so we need to see how to approach those stories. Consent here was making sure that participants understood the relationship between filmmaker and participant, understanding the relationship of participant to the film at large, and making sure that folks knew what to expect at various stages of the film, including impact and release. So for instance, really having conversations with the folks being represented about what does it mean that your story is going to be out in the world? What does it mean that people from all parts of the globe are going to be seeing you on screen? How do you want to be a part of that release process or not? If the film is doing an impact campaign, do the participants want to be a part of that? Do they want to be maybe leading that work? And so it's going to look very different for each film. But for In My Blood It Runs in particular, Duwan and his family were absolutely a part of every step of the way, every stage. And another form that this could take is perhaps showing your participants a rough cut of the film. So before the film is finished, allowing them an opportunity or more to view the edit of the film, give feedback, see how they're being portrayed. And with consent is an emphasis on recognizing that consent is an ongoing process. So especially for this film, with Duwan being a child who's growing up, it was important to recognize that consent needs to be continuous, particularly as Duwan grows up and learns more about the world, changes perspective, opting in again at these different points throughout production of the film, and recognizing that people's lives change. And in a co-creative relationship, sometimes just having one signed release legal document might not feel good enough to the filmmaker or the participant in order to keep moving forward in the same way. So recognizing that just because we have a signed release and legally we could do what we want, it doesn't mean that's not like true co-creation. Real co-creation would be making sure that you're checking in with your participants, that the dynamic that you've established is still feeling good as we move through production. And then another thing, I see some questions starting in the chat, and I think we'll definitely have time at the end of the presentation to dive into some questions. So I'm just going to keep going, but I wanted to recognize that. So another thing that is shifting within documentary is the idea of shared profit with those that are being represented. So historically, many documentary filmmakers have not compensated their participants, following sort of a more journalistic practice of not paying your sources. But we're seeing a shift a bit in our field as there's been more recognition that people are giving so much of their time to these films, to these collaborations, as Louise said. And so it's also their story. And so in these co-creative models, oftentimes it's important to make sure that the financial structure of a production on the back end reflects your power sharing model on the front end. This could take a ton of different forms, but oftentimes the finances and the money and the compensation is a very real way to share power in collaborative films. Another thing that this film did, that In My Blood It Runs did, was they had a pretty robust team of advisors. So this meant that they had a network of support for the people in the film that were being represented, so that that representation didn't rely solely on the protagonists. In other words, they recognized that the Arrente people in Alice Springs that are represented in the film are not a monolith. And so the story that we're seeing is just a small sliver of the experiences in this community. And so having a team of advisors that were from the community, a team of elders, allowed for a lot more feedback to work towards a more authentic representation of the community. And then they also received, they did formal recognition of the traditional owners of the land that they filmed, the Arrente people. And their team structure was also really important to have representation. This meant that they had equal First Nations and non-First Nations filmmakers as the core creatives, and they strove to incorporate all different types of perspectives into the decision-making team. And I think that's really, really important, emphasis on the decision-making team. So there could be a lot of folks involved in the production of a film, but it's really important to make sure that those with the executive power are where the diverse representation is taking place. And then the last thing to mention is centering education on safety, kind of like as they brought their film into the world and they did impact work with In My Blood It Runs, they were asking themselves, how do we train other film teams to look at their own biases around First Nation peoples? How do we create more formal opportunities for the families to teach us what they need to know even before we begin filming, so without being extractive? So it kind of circles back to how can we take what we've learned through the process of making this film and push it forward into other film teams and stories and communities. And so just to recognize kind of the co-creative model, I wanted to share one quote from William Tilmuth, who's of Arrente descent and from Dewan's family. He was also an advisor, both editorially and from the community. He says, "This film shows us that consultation and collaboration work. Both parties wanted to do it. Dewan wanted a film about him, and the film team put aside ego, professionalism, and tried to relearn a new way. This was a vehicle in which the family told the story. They drove it where they wanted it to go, and I am quite proud." So I love that quote because what a beautiful thing to create something that the community feels proud of and can share that with the world. So as we're kind of wrapping things up a bit, I did just want to mention one initiative, a little experiment that Doc Society tried. In the industry at large, there have been a number of films that have kind of been moving the needle on industry standards when working with frontline communities and bringing participants into the filmmaking process in general. At Doc Society, we noticed that across all of our different funds, climate, our BFI initiative, et cetera, there were projects that were playing with different collaborative and participatory models. And so the territory being one of them. And so we decided to bring those grantees together into a co-creation lab to really be a cohort of projects that are thinking about the beauties of co-creation, the challenges, sharing best practices, and really learning from one another. And so I think this just kind of speaks to a trend, not in like, ooh, it's so trendy and cool now to be co-creating, but like a real deep thinking around what this means to be co-creating in storytelling. Each time a film takes a co-creative form, they move the needle a bit. Our minds get opened to new ways of doing things, and the structures that we have in place, meaning our legal structures, our financial structures that have sort of told us, oh, this isn't how we do things. Each time a co-creation project gets out there, those assumptions get challenged when we show them, well, it actually can get done. It can be done in collaboration with the community. Funders can see how this is working and inspire new ways of relating to one another. Distributors and broadcasters can start to see that these films work within their own systems. And we need all types of films in our media ecosystem, but we especially need to call on our deep roots of co-creating with one another to shift and challenge power structures. What can be unlocked when we collaborate together? What can we dream together when we share the power in storytelling? So we're excited to kind of continue this thinking.
Thanks, Nikki. And sorry, Hillary, we passed it over a little bit, but we still have some minutes for questions. I can see a few questions in the chat, and I can already go ahead and answer maybe Aisha's questions, saying she's curious whether the fact that these films have been co-created is clearly visible to the average viewer if they didn't visit the website or dig deeper. And I think it is visible, like for the territory, when you watch the film, it really becomes another film when the community gets the camera and starts shooting, you know, like it's very visible, it becomes a different type of film, almost like a thriller. And yeah, I think you can see it, but of course, yeah, it's always nice to go into their website and see what were the other behind the scene things that the approaches that they took to film it. But I don't know if anyone has anything else to share from the team. And if you have more questions.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. I'd love to add just for Aisha's question. I think sometimes it's not directly stated or visible in films that like we had this power sharing model. But I think it's evident, like I think it's a lot of subconscious work. And so you might not kind of walk away being like, wow, they really collaborated and they shared their finances on the back end. But I think you can really feel it on like a more emotional level. And I think those are kind of the slight subtle shifts and changes that when they're kind of cumulative across a lot of different films really has a deeper effect. So I just wanted to add that.
You have any other questions? You can open the mic or put it in the chat.
Yes, Louise, if you can just jump in, we have a question here from Dr. Constant, and he asks, in this process of documentation and collaboration with local communities, do you have contacts in the countries of the Congo Basin to approach local communities, indigenous people on the front line? So that's the question. And if I could just attempt to respond to this, always. And this is based deeply on the belief that, you know, we cannot purport to know what the challenges, the realities are in a different context or region. And so we always work with the filmmakers and with the cultural organizers who are there. And we see our job mainly as just to support what they already want to say or the stories that they already want to tell. And the support comes in different ways, whether it's through funding or whether it's through just sharing the resources that we have developed over time, or some of the contacts and networks that we have developed over time. And we are basically there to contribute to what they view success as, and what they feel their communities really want to be seen or want to happen as a result of those stories. And so for as an example, we did a climate story lab just in January this year, a climate story lab South African edition, and we had an amazing project that participated from the Congo called Congo on Pan, and it's an amazing podcast series at the intersection of energy access, climate issues, and human rights. And we're working closely with a journalist and a producer called Bob Yala. He's based at the Congo right now. Actually, let me share with you the link and you can have a look later when you have some time. And also, whilst there, you'll see also other projects coming out of the region. Why not? Have a look and, let us know what you think. But to answer your question, yes. Yes.
We have another question from Mega in the chat. How are you seeing approaches to co-creation storytelling vary across regions and geographies? I'm not sure about regions and geography. I think I'll throw to Nikki, but before I just want to say that I think a lot of the examples of the co-creative films that we've seen come from films that are doing in co-creatively with Indigenous communities. So we're really happy and proud to see that. But Nikki, you've been a part of the co-creation lab. I don't know if you had seen any trends across the regions.
Yeah, sure. I think, it's interesting because I think a lot of Western filmmakers are learning a lot from Indigenous communities. And particularly, I'm kind of thinking about the Western legacy of single author approaches and really kind of breaking that down. And I don't know if it's necessarily, they're not creating maybe a new way to think about it, but kind of going back to really deep roots of Indigenous cultural practices of collaboration and moving away from individualism to collectivism. And so I can kind of see, at least in the American films that we're working with, they're learning from other cultures, but then kind of trying to fit it within the American systems. And every time that happens, you kind of push the borders a little bit of what's possible. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Hillary, I think we're just about time. Sorry that we passed a little bit.
That's okay. Thank you all for joining today. This has been a really rich discussion. And so thank you to the Doc Society team. Our next session, our Solution Series session, will be on May 18th at the same time as today's session. And it will be with our partner, Habitus. Habitus is working on a basket of loss and damage activities in Southwest Bangladesh. I've put the link in the chat and I hope to see you all in a month. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hillary.